Should the super rich be taxed on their wealth rather than their income?
Yes, absolutely they should. But also, that's not really going to be enough, is it? It's time that countries actually start dealing with all of these foreigners that are coming in to leech off our economies. No, I don't mean them, although I will get back to them. No, I'm talking about these guys, giant multinational, multi-trillion dollar giga corporations that siphon wealth out of everyone's economy and into the pockets of an increasingly smaller group of ridiculously wealthy individuals. See, part of the problem is that the super rich is not really a local phenomenon, right? We have a global consumer capitalist society. A global economy means a global wealthy elite. So when you're trying to treat the problem locally, you can't just go after the wealthy people because most of them don't live in your country, right? They're outside of your reach. But what isn't outside of your reach is the mechanism by which they make themselves super wealthy, or at least the portion of it that they use to operate within and take advantage of your economy specifically. You have to get your hands on the money on its way into their pockets. If you wait until they've already got their grubby little fingers all over it, then it disappears behind like a firewall of accountants and financial lawyers. You know, in 2019, Amazon reported over 13 billion pounds in revenue in the UK on its US accounts, but only like a third of that appeared on its UK filings under Amazon Services UK, which is because the vast majority of it was diverted through Amazon Luxembourg in order to avoid paying taxes. In fact, some estimates say that Amazon Luxembourg had an annual revenue of over 57 billion euros in 2019. And I say some estimates because it is actually quite hard to find clear, concise numbers on a lot of this, which I think is kind of the point, right? To make it purposely difficult to unpack and understand. Now, what that means is either every single human being in Luxembourg spent like 90,000 euros on Amazon purchases in 2019, or, and hear me out, Amazon are doing the exact same thing to avoid paying taxes in lots of other countries as well. Now, in 2021, Amazon's UK revenue skyrocketed to, some estimates say, over 23 billion pounds. And again, the vast majority of that disappeared off to Luxembourg for tax purposes. Now, that year, their total tax burden in the UK was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.7 billion pounds, which it's important to note there that most of that are things like national insurance or pay-as-you-earn income tax, which means they're deducting that from the salaries of their employees. Amazon doesn't pay that, their employees do. And the rest of it was things like VAT, right? Sales tax, which they add on to the price of the products that they sell, which means the consumer pays for that, right? You pay for that. Amazon doesn't pay that at all. Now, in 2021, Amazon paid a grand total of £0 in corporation tax, which means that year they reported £0 worth of actually taxable profit. And that's during a year of roughly 17 to 23 billion in revenue. Now, one of the ways they accomplished this was by taking advantage of a 130% super deduction, which was a temporary tax initiative to help companies deal with the strain of the pandemic, which obviously Amazon were already dealing with rather swimmingly by themselves. So basically, they were able to completely offset profitability by taking advantage of a subsidy that paid them to invest in developing their own business's infrastructure. Now, why on earth, during a cost of living crisis, or really any time at all, is the taxpayer paying one of the wealthiest people on the planet to invest in growing and developing his already monopolistic mega corporation? That does not seem like a very sensible system to me. Now, this is why taxing the rich is so tricky to actually pull off, right? First of all, high income taxes do basically nothing. Jeff Bezos doesn't pay himself a very high salary. In fact, his salary is something like $82,000 $1 billion a year. And he also doesn't have hundreds of billions of dollars. What he has is hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Amazon stock and other assets. Now, he uses those assets as collateral to borrow money at low interest rates, which is debt and therefore technically not taxable. And then he owns assets through companies that employ similar trickery to remain technically not profitable and therefore not taxable. And beyond that, wealth tax can only really be applied to someone who lives in your country, right? Jeff Bezos doesn't live in the UK, but his company does do business in the UK. They siphon wealth out of the UK economy, which makes the company grow, which makes the share price go up, which makes Jeff Bezos a richer person. That's what his wealth is made of, right? Amazon stock. So his wealth is not in the UK, but obviously some of it is. And this is true in every single country where Amazon does business and avoids taxes. I'm just using the UK as one example here. Now, a lot of people like to justify the special treatment afforded to these corporate behemoths by saying, well, they create jobs, so they're good for the economy. But the thing is, a lot of the jobs that they create are quite objectively very, very bad for the economy. At least as long as we're still pretending that what we're doing here is capitalism. See, when you've got a system full of tax avoidance loopholes that are only properly accessible to giant corporations, then you're regulating the system in favor of the super wealthy, which makes the doublespeak particularly insidious because they keep insisting on referring to what they're doing as deregulation. You've created a system that actually favors monopolies, right? That's anti-competition, which is basically capitalism's slogan, right? Free and fair competition. Remember that? When the competition is skewed in favor of the people at the very, very top, what you're going to end up seeing is more and more of the economy ends up getting completely dominated by a small group of very large companies, which incidentally is what we're seeing. Now, that doesn't just reduce competition between companies, it also reduces competition in the job market. Let's say you're like a barista trying to work in an environment where the market is being mostly dominated by two very large corporations. Hypothetically, let's call them something like Starbucks and Costa Coffee. If Starbucks are not paying you well and they're not treating you well, your only option is to go and apply for a job at Costa Coffee, which means there's no real pressure on them to pay you anymore or treat you any better. Now, you might be able to find a job at like a small local cafe where you know the owners and they treat you like family, but the thing is, they're trying to compete in a marketplace that's being dominated by giant corporations given special treatment that they can't afford to gain access to themselves. So they can't really afford to pay you anymore either. They're fighting to survive in a game that's actively rigged against them. They're just struggling to stay open until they're not able to do that anymore, which is what happens, which is why places like that are increasingly fewer and further between. And the fewer there are, the less competition there is, the less the local population actually own their own economy, and the less competitive the marketplace becomes, both for employers and for employees. Now, this is why it's so incredibly unsurprising that the politicians that are most aggressively in favor of helping giant corporations wreak havoc in our economies by allowing them to play pretend capitalism with the training wheels on while everybody else has to actually work for a living are the very same politicians who want you to believe that the reason you're struggling to buy food or pay your bills is because of foreigners and brown people who are coming to steal your jobs and steal your benefits. Trust me, your economy is set up to benefit people like this way more than people like this. Yeah, I told you we'd get back to that eventually. Now, my issue with the people that keep complaining that they can't talk about immigration without being called a racist is that every time we try to talk about immigration, you insist on derailing the conversation by being a racist. You don't want to talk about immigration. You want to talk about how scary you think Islam is, or what percentage of school children in what town are now non-white. That's a race conversation. That's a religion conversation. Immigration is a logistics conversation. And there actually has been a rather dramatic increase in immigration to a lot of Western countries in recent years. But notably, most of them are not asylum seekers, right? Most of them are workers and students. And the vast majority of illegal immigrants to places like the UK are students and workers who illegally overstay their visas. So again, not these people. Now, when you bring a lot of new people into a country over a short period of time, that's going to put a strain on the infrastructure and the public services of that country, which is going to have a negative effect on the people who rely on that infrastructure and those public services in order to live their lives. That's the logistics conversation, right? That conversation is a meaningful conversation that actually needs to be had. How to manage immigration, especially considering that the politicians responsible for overseeing the increased immigration are also responsible for actively trying to dismantle the public services they're putting a strain on by doing it. Especially considering that in a consumer capitalist, infinite growth-based economy, population growth is necessary to keep that economy from collapsing under its own weight, which means that the immigration is in favor of the super wealthy, and the politicians are convincing you to be upset at the immigrants and not at the super wealthy. Now, this is a real conversation that needs to be had and needs to be taken seriously. In fact, this is also a real conversation that needs to be had and needs to be taken seriously. There's definitely mismanagement happening here, right? Funds are definitely being misallocated here. There's definitely a lack of proper clarity and oversight as to what is going on. But this is a blip on the radar. If you think this is the most vital issue in an economy that is trying to sustain the lives of nearly 70 million people, then you are being led by the nose.